Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm very happy to be joined by Matthew Stults. And today, hopefully, some of you will have heard that name and may recognize who that is, and many of you may not. So I will make sure to introduce Matthew. He studies the interface between exercise, physical activity, and mental stress, which his research demonstrates is related to impaired muscular recovery after exercise. He also investigates the impact of stress on efforts to be physically active. So kind of stress, activity, this is all stuff that we love talking about on the podcast. He has a PhD in Kinesiology and health education and Clinical Exercise Physiologist at Yale-New Haven Hospital. So Matt, is there anything else you want to kind of let the listeners know about you? I know that was a very kind of rough introduction.
No, that was a great introduction. Part of it sounded very familiar, by the way. I'm sort of somewhat of a generalist in terms of my interest in sports medicine. So I'm very interested in stress and recovery and how stress, like you said, impairs our efforts to be physically active. So that's much more of a psychobiological approach. But I was an athlete for many years, and up until recently, participating in CrossFit and all of the Spartan races, and I practice at Yale-New Haven Hospital in surgery. As a clinical exercise physiologist, and I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years. I've been certified by the American College of Sports Medicine since 2002, first as a health fitness instructor and now as an exercise physiologist. So, and I taught for many years as well at Teachers College, Columbia, New York, and at Northern Illinois University outside Chicago. So I somewhat equally divided between research, teaching, and clinical practice.
Awesome. And I think that's helpful because a lot of the kind of the greatness about the podcast and the people we end up bringing on, like yourself, is they can kind of put their knowledge into practical terms. And I guess as a teacher, you've had to do that, which is great. Right. And the thing and you kind of touched on it maybe, just love to hear what got you so interested in kind of mental stress and the relationship with exercise.
Yeah, that's a really funny story because as a young master's student, when I was 22, 23 years old, starting my graduate studies, stress was my least favorite topic. We studied the Selye model of the GAS, right? The General Adaptation Syndrome, which is just a horrible sounding acronym, first of all, right? GAS. And I had no interest in these phenomena whatsoever. But as a doctoral student, I was making a transition from studying exercise gerontology. I had done a Fulbright fellowship in Finland, in Jyväskylä. And when I moved to Austin, Texas, my advisor, John Bartholomew, whom we know as Bart, he basically just told me that I'm going to study stress. He gave me a data set. He said I was going to analyze this data set. I'm going to write it up. I'm going to publish in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And we did that. And he basically set the course for me. And I was quite hesitant because studying stress clearly made me stressed. Right? Okay. Especially one of the studies I'm more well known for, the stress and recovery study as I did as part of my dissertation. It was very stressful just to conduct this study. And we can get into the nuances of that. But in short, I sort of just fell into this line of research. And of course, now I've been completely enthralled and intrigued with these phenomena that we've been observing. And we've published some papers and we've been cited pretty well. So I think I might continue with it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's sometimes... I think I've read various books where people talk about like following your passion or whatever, and a lot of people end up becoming passionate about a thing that they weren't even aware that that was a passion, or in your case, it was something you really weren't passionate about.
Right, exactly.
And for the listeners, actually, well, for myself, can we define stress? Is there a clear kind of definition from your standpoint?
The first thing that pops into mind is just the challenge to homeostasis. I think most of your listeners will be familiar with the concept of equilibrium or homeostasis from a scientist named Cannon, and this is one of the preeminent concepts in all science, the concept of homeostasis. And so a challenge to that homeostasis is maybe the simplest way to define stress. So that's a very psychobiological approach. And Selye was really a physiologist. He wasn't a psychologist. And so many psychologists have not favored recently the whole concept of stress. They more favor the concepts of anxiety or depression or other facets of mental health, because just defining stress is somewhat it's easy. It's just not easy to really define stress. But if we just start with a working definition of, a challenge to homeostasis, that seems to be a good start.
And I guess at least our audience are very much physique orientated in like building muscle, right, losing fat. And that's all a change to homeostasis. We're constantly, as a bodybuilder, maybe you're constantly battling this homeostasis. And any athlete, I guess, you're always trying to progress and improve. So stress is ever present, right, for us.
So yeah, it's exercise science 101 or kinesiology 101, you probably learn about supercompensation, right? So exercise is stress, right? Clearly you are stressing yourself with a physical stressor, exercise, and a mental stressor at that too, because you're hoping to challenge yourself enough that you're going to have some physiological decrements, and then you're going to supercompensate and you're going to build back up and reach a new functional baseline above your previous baseline. So yeah, it's a super relevant concept for anyone who's interested in making any type of fitness gains.
And actually, you mentioned it in terms of how it's hard from a psychological aspect to recognize stress and kind of clearly define it. I guess physiologically, you can have things like hunger, or you feel full, or you feel like soreness, fatigue. A question I always kind of think of is, people talk about not being stressed, but could you be stressed and not necessarily recognize it as like you're like, oh, I'm not stressed, but it could be someone who's under quite a lot of stress?
Yes, stress suppressors, people who don't recognize stress, or somehow they just push it out of their minds. There's a concept called alexithymia, people who just don't recognize their emotions, don't recognize that they're stressed. We could give something like the perceived stress scale, the PSS, which is a very simple short measure of subjective stress. And there'll be some people who are clearly stressed who rate themselves as having zero stress. And perhaps the best example I have of that, I was working on a study where we had some refugees from Iraq. This would have been around 2005, 2006. They had immigrated to the United States. Clearly, huge life changes. These fellows they were fluent in English, so there wasn't just a language barrier. But when we gave them a variety of different stress scales, they almost always reported that they had zero stress. So I think there are also cultural facets to this, and maybe it's just not masculine to say that you have stress. You just it's sort of this alpha mentality of I'm untroubled and nothing stresses me out. So yeah, that adds another layer of complexity to this whole issue.
No, I think listening to that, like, just, I don't know, you think about old school bro bodybuilder type mentality. It's like harder is better. No, I can do this. I'm hardcore. That kind of mentality. So I think that definitely on the surface runs through a lot of kind of the people that weight train.
Well, humans thrive on stress, right? It's just a very human characteristic. Stress. We need stress. If we didn't have any stress, we would be bored, right? And being completely bored is perhaps worse than being stressed. When I was serving in the American military, you think, wow, there must be like immense challenges. It must be really tough. It must be really grueling. But there were probably more days that were just completely boring, right? We were just cleaning or ironing our uniforms, or like there's no stress whatsoever. And those are actually the hardest days because you needed you're waiting for and needed some stimuli, something to excite you. So there really needs to be some sort of happy medium between, not enough stress and too much stress.
I think that's really interesting because I actually always think about it in terms of, I don't know, sometimes for myself personally, I like thrive on the stress. And sometimes when I am resting, or I think I went to like a weekend spa once and I just felt, I felt like I felt awful. And I don't know if I was just feeling all the kind of subsequent stress hitting me, or it was the fact that actually doing something that I thought as de-stressing almost stressed me more than actually doing something that was meant to be stressful.
Well, also, were you disconnected from your phone?
Yes.
Okay, so that okay. Well, that could be another, factor thrown in there. Anytime, someone takes away my phone, like if I go to a spa or something, I just get like a little stressed out and jittery. It takes me a few hours to get used to that. So, yeah.
I also think of the example of like a coffee is like a stimulant, but also sitting down to having a cup of coffee. If you like coffee, somewhat feels like de-stressing. So it's kind of, I guess a lot of these, I don't know if I'm right in thinking that some things can kind of be inherently kind of both stressful, but also de-stressing in different ways. Like obviously that's a physiological potential uplift of stress from having caffeine, but de-stressing maybe psychologically by having that kind of nice tasting black liquid go down your throat.
Right. I mean, just the whole concept of distress versus eustress. So eustress, with an EU at the beginning, eustress is a good stress. And then the distress, DIS, being distressed is clearly a bad thing. So stress in itself, just the word stress, is actually neutral.
Very interesting. And I don't know.
Yeah.
My final question before we dig into that study that you spoke about, are there subjective and objective markers of stress? Do you have like those available? Do you use those?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. Subjective ways to measure stress. You can obviously give people pen and paper surveys, right? The like perceived stress scale or the life event questionnaires. You can also corroborate a person's stress by interviewing significant others in their life, a roommate, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a mom or dad, son, daughter, whoever, right? Because they might have greater insights into the stress level of that person. So that's called triangulation, triangulating stress by asking the person themselves, asking people who know that person, and then objective biomarkers like cortisol as measured in saliva or hair. Obviously, adrenaline, salivary amylase is a really popular biomarker to measure as an indicator of stress. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the triangulation one, I think when you think about that, that could be a great way to get those people that suppress that stress, and then you ask their kind of better half or whatever you call it, are they stressed? And they probably have a bit more of an objective opinion in some ways.
Refugees.
Yeah.
Their wives would pull us aside and say, these guys are like really, really, really stressed, but they would never show it. They were it's stoicism, right? They were just extremely stoic. So, but, stoicism in itself, just that rigidity or appearance of being stoic, that in itself is an interesting emotional marker of stress, right? So, some people, when they're stressed, they activate. They become like extremely hyper, or they have something like mania, right? They're just very active. Maybe they're really expressive with their emotions. And then there's another group of people who do the exact opposite, right? That's just sort of hide in. They clench up. They withdraw. They avoid things. They become more stoic. So it's almost like you have to profile a person. And there's certain stress profile, and everyone's different.
Almost sounded like kind of the fight or flight response. The kind of stoicism feels like a bit more flight versus the people that get kind of irate being that fighter.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's really not just fight or flight. It's really fight, flight, or freeze. Okay. So, in the face of stress, it's also potentially adaptive to just freeze. And a really good example of this actually is our missed interview last week. Because when I sat down on my computer and I had done my hair and I straightened out my tie and everything, and I turned on the computer and I'm all ready for our interview, and then I suddenly realized that I've missed our interview. And it was funny because I wasn't stressed in the sense that I wasn't like suddenly emailing you, and I wasn't getting frantic. I wasn't frantic. I just sort of sat there for several minutes and like suspended animation, or like utter disbelief. Like, how did I just miss this? Because we had exchanged so many emails, right? So that's just sort of a good example of sort of like a freezing response in response to stress.
And it easily done, but I like the example. So to go over the study you spoke about was the effects of stress on physical activity and exercise, which,
Yes.
as you said, it's been cited over 400 times now, reviewed in 168 papers. And first of all, I don't know if you want to just kind of summarize what you found. I know that's a very broad question, but I don't know if you do have a summary from that.
Yes. So I was approached by Dr. Rajita Sinha. She's at the Yale School of Medicine, and I was working for her in the Department of Psychiatry. And about a month into my new job with her, she approached me and asked me if I would write up a paper on simply just the associations of psychological stress with facets of physical activity, markers of physical activity or exercise. Then it was basically it. She just commissioned me. She said, "Hey, I'm interested in this idea." It was actually her idea, and she didn't have any more advice. She just sort of like let me run with it. And I spent about 1.5 to 2 years developing that paper. And after reading about 400 papers that looked at various slants on that topic, what I came to the conclusion was that by and far, yes, psychological stress does seem to be associated with less physical activity. But how that pans out is really interesting. First of all, we had done a study with Rafer Lutz, Dr. Rafer Lutz, who was at Baylor University. He passed away several years ago from cancer, but he had completed a study with John Bartholomew and myself. And what we found is that people who were habitual exercisers were less likely to be adversely affected by stress. As a matter of fact, people who are habitual exercisers sometimes exercise more in the face of stress, okay? Because that's just what they like to do. It's what makes them feel good, right? And that totally makes sense. If you're stressed and you're a habitual exerciser, you like to exercise, perhaps you're an athlete, you might be more likely to, skip the homework and go to the gym, right? Or spend a little extra time at the gym, or socialize a little bit more at the gym, or do a little bit more cardio or whatever. So there's a group of people that in the face of stress seem to be more active. It's what I was just telling you about 5 minutes ago. They activate, okay? So they're stress activators, okay? And then there's a group of people who are completely inhibited by stress, right? They're sort of deactivated, they withdraw. So in the face of stress, their whole exercise routine just seems to fall apart. Okay. And then there's a group of people in the middle who don't seem to be affected one way or the other. They could be stressed even quite a bit, and they're just steady. They go to the gym 3 times a week. They work, they get on the cardio or they lift weights for 30 minutes, and they're unflappable. They just continue to do that. So broadly speaking, what we found in our review paper that's been cited so well is that essentially that's basically the way it pans out across all of these papers that we reviewed. Okay, so the majority of papers find that in the face of stress, people move less. They're less active. Their intensity in the gym is just not as good. And then however, there's another group of people that, particularly, maybe men, that seem to exercise more. And so I think that was a novel finding in this review paper, because it's sort of, again, it goes back to that stress profiling, right? Which I think is really important for coaches to know, right? Now, if your athletes are stressed with the finals or something like this, they're not all going to respond the same to stress.
I guess, yeah. I mean, if, for example, I don't know, if you're coaching a student and they had like studies coming up in the next months, you might assume, I'll reduce your training because that's a stressor and that's going to cause like worse outcomes for you. You can concentrate more and be de-stressed by having less. But they might be, like you said, someone who actually, for them, doing some exercises, de-stressing. Is there a kind of sweet spot for people? Because obviously activity and doing exercise is inherently kind of somewhat taxing and stressful, but for some people that is in like a eustress. Is there a point at which like a U-shaped bell curve?
I would like to find that out. I can tell you how I respond to stress. I'll just speak from my own personal experience. I think what happens to me in face of like a truly negative, like aversive stress, I probably will spend more time at the gym. I will be activated in that sense. I will spend maybe 2 or more hours at the gym, but I will not be focused on the quality of my workout. So when I'm stressed, what I'm aiming for is a certain intensity level of the exercise, sort of a constant intensity level, because that just feels good to me and it's what I'm used to. And it's sort of my dominant response in the gym. But am I really focused on my training objectives during that workout? Probably not. I'm not really focused on challenging myself. I'm not even counting sets or repetitions, right? It's sort of like, so it's like the whole prefrontal cortex is just sort of shut down. The cognitive pre-planning and planning and scheming out everything. That's just not working. And my emotions are just totally taking over here, right? I'm just going for an emotional effect in the gym, right? I'm just burning energy and I'm trying to just diffuse that negative tension that's built up through the stress. So that's what happens to me. I don't know if that really gets at your question.
I have a question off the back of it, because it's an interesting scenario. Because I was thinking, if I had a client who was stressed and they were doing kind of like, they were someone like yourself, like an activator, and they were going to the gym and they weren't executing the plan as we had laid out, I would be thinking, I need to, if that person who I know reacts like that becomes stressed, kind of almost talk them down and try and prevent them from doing it. Is that, do you think, a good strategy? Because obviously actually doing as you said is de-stressing them at the same time, but it might be counter to what we're trying to achieve from like a coaching and training aspect. Whereas I guess for someone who freezes or kind of pulls back, I might have to encourage them to continue going to the gym and pushing themselves, but maybe that also is counter to what their kind of stress response is ideally.
So that was basically the whole point of my dissertation. What we did was we took a group of like highly stressed, chronically stressed individuals, and we pushed them really super hard. Okay, so if they had been in there by themselves doing this bout of resistance training, they would never have been able to achieve the level of intensity that we had plotted out for them. It was a very complicated workout that we were giving these people. But me as the coach, as the trainer in that study, I was able to take this group of extremely stressed people, and they were very stressed, and get them through an extremely vigorous level of bout of resistance training. The consequence to that was they were able to rise to the occasion. They were able to get through it, sometimes with a lot of screams and literally. But their recovery was really bad.
Right.
Okay. So that was the whole point of that paper. Yeah. These people, they were able to get through it. They were somehow able to ramp up. They were able to give energy. But then the recovery took 2 times, 3 times, 4 times as long as a person who was very low in stress. So, my sort of general thought about this is that stress is like a crisis of energy. And I've said this in some other interviews and podcasts before, like stress is a crisis of energy. And there's, maybe you can somehow find the energy to get through these workouts, but then you just don't have the energy for the recovery, right? So something has to give, in other words.
I think that relates a little bit, or to me, it seems like it relates a little bit to the kind of the super compensation idea, or at least you accumulate kind of training volume and potentially stress over time. And maybe you can push yourself very hard, even when you're in a very stressed position, but knowingly, potentially that's going to cause you to have to pull back, kind of potentially deload within a training cycle. And that is nice because it works within what we kind of know as well.
Right. So maybe you're the type of person that activates with stress, and maybe you activate even more. So you're working out really, really hard, but you have to recognize the fact that there's a risk that, over the next several days, you just may not recover as well. You might be really sore. You might be extremely fatigued, and your future workouts in the next few days are going to be much worse. Right. Again, going back to the super compensation response, because you're just now your equilibrium again is disrupted. You're working at a much lower level of function. So that's where a good coach or trainer really comes into play. Right. That's why you really need that extra set of eyes to help you think through those actions and consequences.
Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the podcast. Just wanted to take one moment of your time to actually talk about our coaching services over at Revive Stronger. We at Revive Stronger, we offer an incredible premium personal coaching service just for people like you, and I know you will love it. Do you want to work with us? Here's what I need you to do. Head over to revivestronger.com. Go up to the coaching tab. Click on online coaching. Once there, read through the requirements and what it takes to be an online client. Once finished, hit apply now and you're only one step away from applying to our services. Fill out the Google form and you're done. And that was basically it. A coach is going to reach out to you shortly, and then it's Team Revive Stronger.
And this actually relates really well to a question that Miguel Acute sent over for you. It goes along the lines of, what does the relationship between stress and recovery / gains actually look like? Is it a linear relationship where every increase in stress leads to a detriment in recovery, or does a certain amount of stress have to be accumulated before it becomes detrimental to training? So if getting a little stressed about a deadline, will that interfere with my training at all, or does it need to be a large amount of stress to have a detriment that's seen?
That's an excellent question. In other words, is there some sort of like threshold that you have to cross? Right. Yeah. In order that we didn't study that. In the study I did, the studies we conducted, we screened large numbers of people, hundreds and hundreds of people, to find highly stressed people and to find low stress people. The high stress people were one standard deviation or more, maybe 1.5 standard deviations above the mean, above the average for chronic stress. So they were quite stressed. The low stress people were 1.5 standard deviation, something like this, below the mean. So that's a really excellent question. I don't know if I can directly answer that question, but I can tell you this. If you have just a little bit of stress, there are strategies or tactics that you can employ to maybe just sort of diffuse that little bit of stress so that you can continue with your training as planned. We know that even something as little as going for a 10-minute walk, right, or even a 5-minute walk can help you to relax and help you to diffuse stress. So the thought that I've had is that, maybe in situations like this, you're having just a bad day. Okay. So that's what you're getting at, right? Okay. You're just having a bad day. You're not like sweating from like chronic, unremitting stress over several days. Okay. Let's say you're having a bad day. Okay. You know what? Extend your warm up a little bit. right? Extend your warm up a little bit. Maybe add 5 or 10 extra minutes of stretching in there. And it's possible that in itself could help to relieve that stress that you're feeling. And then you're energized, you're ramped up, and you're ready for your regularly scheduled training.
Love that.
Okay? So, and actually that was some of the extra content that I was going to share you. There's a systematic way that I do this with my own students and clients and patients. Okay, now we have to recognize though that sometimes people do not respond well even to that extra ramping up time, that extra warm up time. Okay, even after they're given an extra 10 minutes to warm up or ramp up, they're still just really exhausted, and maybe in some cases they're actually feeling worse. Okay, so when I see that happen, it's sort of a flag to me that okay, this person might be just really chronically stressed, and we should cancel the regularly scheduled moderate to vigorous intensity training program, and we're just going to extend it and just do light. We're just going to this is just an easy day. This is just a de-stressing day. The rest of the routine is just light intensity. And if they can't tolerate that, okay, we're going to go over to the floor. We're going to do some extra stretches, some light functional exercises, or in some extreme cases, right? Someone who's has had a traumatic recent stressor, which I have observed. We've just canceled the rest of the workout because they really need a recovery day. They just need a day off, or they need to go deal with whatever they're stressing about. Right? They could use that extra 30 minutes. So there is somewhat of a systematic way to approach that. If you're working with someone who might just have had a bad day, they're just mildly stressed, or someone who might be, moderately stressed from a series of bad things that are going on in their life, or maybe they just had like a traumatic stressor. So a coach or a trainer needs to develop some sort of skill set or repertoire of activities, like a decision tree almost, that they can do with their clients. And if anyone wants to contact me, I'm more than happy to provide the strategies I've used.
Awesome.
The actual decision trees.
Do you have, I don't know if you're able to talk through the decision tree. Do you know it off the top of your head well enough to talk through like an example decision tree, or is that too much, or maybe just it might not be perfect, but kind of roughly what it might look like?
Essentially, it's what I just said. It's what I just already talked through. I ask people, okay, it starts with the question, are you stressed today? Right? Are you feeling stress? Is there anything that you want to talk about? If someone says, yeah, I had a really bad day, I'm feeling stressed. And it's going back to those objective versus subjective markers of stress, right? So people might say, yeah, I'm feeling really down. But you can also see it, right? So I had a client before, she stands out top of my mind. She really suppresses her stress. She never admits that she's stressed. She always puts on the bright and cheery face, but I could just see like she's white, she's ashen, she has a strange grayish color to her. She's drained. Okay, she's just really, really drained. She's trying to put on the best face, but working in this area for long enough, I realized, okay, let's extend the warm up a little bit. Okay, so usually we do like a 10-minute warm up. I'm going to add an extra 10 minutes. We did a 10-minute warm up. And I'm just looking for a response. So the crucial thing is, how does that person then respond to that warm-up? And on that one particular day that I'm thinking of, I saw her color return, right? I saw her color return. She's speaking normally. Her voice is more clear. I can see that she's moving more vigorously. She responded well. So that told me, okay, she's ready to do her normal scheduled workout, and we did that. But on other days, with this same client, what I observed was that even after that extended warm-up, she couldn't ramp up. I mean, there was nothing more that she could really give. So I told her in situations like this, okay, we're not counting repetitions. We're not going to do we're not doing the whole 3 sets of 10 thing. What we're going for now is just psychological wellness. We're just moving to feel good. That's the whole point. Okay. So, let's do some bicep curls, but I'm not even counting the repetitions. You're just moving for the sake of moving. You're moving to make yourself feel good. And at any point you don't feel good, you just stop. Okay. And on days like that, that also was effective. Okay. It was just a psychological wellness day. And so I know a lot of coaches are not willing or able, or they can't individualize training sessions like that. But I think in some cases that maybe they should. And I think what they would find is that, okay, maybe that training session didn't count for much, right? I mean, there was no gain in fitness. Maybe there wasn't even a maintenance of fitness, but the hope is that, okay, tomorrow there will be, right? Or maybe in 2 days there will be, okay? So I think we have to give people some credit for that, right? People have bad days and there's ways to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really nice tool to almost auto-regulate somewhat your training. And if maybe I work online with clients, but I could definitely describe what you said there and kind of talk them through that and hope they can be objective enough to know whether or not to push themselves. Essentially, what you're able to do there is make sure you're producing a eustress and not de-stress in that sense, because it sounds like if someone was just to push through when they were grey in the face, not feeling well, they just cause a de-stressor and they'd have a kind of the recovery debt that was unwanted afterwards. Whereas you're trying to kind of promote eustress all the time, or for the majority of the time, at least, of someone's training.
Yeah, and there's another thing to consider here too, is that people are at a higher risk when they're feeling like just really negative emotions, right? I mean, they're at a higher risk for injury. They're at a higher risk of, there's just losing focus and dropping a weight. There's a higher risk of, so I think it's also in the trainer, the athlete's, or the coach's best interest, even maybe from a legal standpoint, to have these strategies, because, there's a profound effect of stress on concentration, focus, planning, self-monitoring, right? Okay, so they're not self-monitoring as well. So, in some, extreme cases of stress, it might just behoove the coach or the trainer to just say, okay, let's resume tomorrow.
And on the note of kind of trying to reduce stress, have you looked heavily into kind of ways that people can kind of, the best ways people can reduce stress? I don't know if there's certain kind of, people talk about meditation, or you talked about the walks, and people talk about supplementation, like ashwagandha or something. I don't know if these are things you've looked much into.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we have. So working with Dr. Sinha at the Yale Stress Center here in New Haven, Connecticut, we've done studies with mindfulness meditation, which works wonders. I mean, it really does. It sounds very new agey and maybe a little gimmicky, and everyone's talking about it, but it really can help. And I mean, the basic precepts of mindfulness meditation, of just being in the moment, right? And it's so difficult to be in the moment when you're stressed, right? Because you're thinking about the past, you're thinking a lot about the future, threats that could arise in the future, but just being in the present moment, doing so non-judgmentally, because when you're stressed, you're probably hitting on yourself because you feel like you did something wrong or someone else did something wrong. So trying to detach from those negative judgments is also very, very helpful. And so it takes time, it takes practice, but even someone who's only been doing it for 5 or 10 minutes can derive some benefits from it. If you keep practicing it for several weeks, you're going to get better and better at it. And there might be really useful ways to integrate something like a mindfulness meditation, maybe even before the workout, after the workout, or maybe even ways during the workout, like in between sets, for instance. So, or as you're conducting the workout. So I know there are people out there who are investigating ways to do that with athletes, but that's definitely one way that you can do it.
Yeah, I've seen, it always amazes me to see in the Olympics when the weightlifters do their lifts and they amp themselves up, they do the lift, and then they're just completely kind of chill afterwards. They just, I don't know, they put their music back in and they just look really kind of recovered, and whereas other people would just continue to feel amped after that. And I guess that's I always think that that's a really powerful way to kind of get the right balance between the two, kind of knowing when to be kind of stressful and when to kind of then come back into your shell.
Yeah, that's something that takes a lot of practice and a lot of effort to figure out, like what type of routine is best for you. Maybe it's guided imagery, maybe it's self-affirmations that you listen to and audio, which I found all those things to be helpful, and maybe even combining those things. So yeah, and then of course, avoiding stress. Just avoiding stress, right? We're humans. We have very large brains. We have a prefrontal cortex that works very powerfully. We can use these things to plan our day, plan our week, plan the months ahead of us, and avoid stress, right? So, for instance, with our interview mishap a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I could have double checked those emails a little better to make sure that I had the right time, realizing that there's a 5-hour difference between you and the United Kingdom and myself in the United States. But I sort of made a few assumptions, right, about when the interview was going to be. So I could have just avoided that stress. The best way to deal with stress is just to avoid stress. Okay. So organize your life better. Right? Have more smarter goals. Maybe plan your day the previous day, right? Before you end your day, you're planning the next day. You're reviewing that plan just before you go to bed. Those are like easy strategies to just avoid stress. So the best way to deal with stress is really to avoid it, and then come up with, or not come up with, but generate a list of like all of the stressors that you foresee could be happening in whatever that time frame is. So let's say you're an Olympic athlete. Well, there could be a problem with your transportation. There could be a problem with my visa. There could be a problem, right? And so you're thinking about those potential stressors beforehand because you're trying to avoid them. So really, that's the number one thing you could do, and that takes the help of sometimes a good trainer or a good coach to help you to see what those stressors might be. Because if you're a 22-year-old athlete, right, you may not be able to see those things. You might be completely blindsided by those things. But an experienced coach or trainer who's 10 or 20 years older than you can foresee those things, right? So eliciting the help from people who are more experienced than you is so helpful. So it's a two-pronged approach. It's avoiding stress. It's dealing with stress that's happening right now. And then there's sort of these routines that help you to be more mindful and clear and just help you to deal with the daily stress.
I love that approach, and especially the kind of, like, you laid it out for like the Olympic athlete, but I'm even thinking for physique athletes, at least in their peak week before like they're stepping on stage, stress reduction's huge. So I'm always like, make sure, like, I give them like a tick sheet that they've got everything they need. They've got their tan booked in. They've got their trunks. Like, they don't need to, they've got their food and they've got it all in the house. They don't need to go and buy anything, because you're completely right. Actually, avoiding stress is the best way to be like low stress. So I'm so glad you laid that out.
Another strategy, speaking of physique, by the way, I signed up for a physique competition about 8 years ago.
Oh, awesome.
Okay.
Signed up. You didn't do it.
I didn't do it. And this is why, because 2 weeks after I signed up for the physique competition, I had a major flood in my apartment.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So I had 500 gallons of raw sewage in my apartment after a torrential downpour here in New Haven, in a historic neighborhood that I lived. And I had already put down a significant amount of money because I hired a coach. And New Haven's kind of a small little mecca for physique competitions here in the United States. And I came to the realization of about two or 3 days after this flood that there's just no way. Like I'm never going to be prepared for this competition, because I don't even have a home right now. No, and that's significant. Okay. Like, you can't just put a happy face on that. Like, I don't have a home. 80% of my clothes have been ruined. I lost my computer, and I'm living in my landlord's basement. Right. Okay. And all of my meals are at diners. I think there's also, my point here being that you also have to know when to get out.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. You have to know, and that also improves with age, So am I going to just continue with, I could just be stoic again, right? And I could be like, okay, I'm the warrior. I'm going to get through this, and I'm going to have this triumphant story at the end, right? I still do this physique competition despite all of this. But I think a wise person would know when to pull out, right? Because there's going to be other competitions, right? And so there's this whole idea. His name is Daniel Kahneman, and he wrote a really famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Perhaps you're familiar with it. And one of the biggest takeaways I took from this book was just the whole idea of when to end something, like when to pull out of a project if it's just not going well. Okay, so that's just a whole nother facet to things. I'm not encouraging your listeners to like give up on their dreams or their stories of triumph. I'm not saying that, but taking time off is okay. Taking care of yourself is okay, right? So I think that's a key take-home message.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I think that's really cool. And the only other thing, I think it's probably far less powerful than the strategies you've already laid out. But did you say you'd looked into any kind of avenues of supplementation? We're always looking for like taking something sounds a lot easier than kind of trying to avoid stress. And obviously, it's a far smaller thing, the top of the pyramid, if we're thinking about effective ways to reduce stress. But do you think there are any kind of decent ones out there?
Well, if you have any, this is the first thing that pops into mind. If you have any vitamin deficiencies, you may not be dealing well with stress. Okay, so it's very common here in the state of Connecticut to have a vitamin D deficiency. Okay, and sure enough, I had that checked, and I did. Okay, so of course I want to take care of that because I was feeling chronically just fatigued, right? Again, stress being like a chronic stress being a crisis of energy, right? I'm looking for more energy here, right? We could do anything if we just have more energy. So absolutely, there are very simple nutritional strategies, getting your vitamin levels checked, intervening then if something's wrong. There was a point where I had to start supplementing with B vitamins and B12 after a really bad illness I had several years ago. Okay, so absolutely, and then we live in an age here where people are on keto, the keto diet. People are very low in carbs. Just before competitions, of course, you're like extremely low in carbs. Well, of course, when you're stressed, what do you want? You have cravings for carbs, right? You have cravings for, it's proven, you have cravings for highly palatable foods, right? Your body is like just dying, it's begging for highly palatable foods. It wants the sugar, it wants the fat. Why? Because it wants that energy. It wants to store that energy, right? It's a crisis of energy. So we have to like really think clearly about that and plan for that. We need contingency plans, right? If you're going to be low in carbs, then you're going to need even better strategies to deal with stress.
I guess, like you said, the kind of the hallmark of stress is kind of not being at homeostasis. So any deficiencies, like being in a calorie deficit or a deficiency of, body fat, one for a competitor, but vitamins and minerals, like actually probably somewhat easier things to potentially level out and get in check. And as someone who is putting themselves purposely through a stressful thing to get to a certain outcome, you can try and keep as many things under control as possible. So like sleep, for example, taking care of that as best you can. So I think that's actually a really nice and powerful sort of thing for people to think about. Just like taking a checkup of everything, get a blood panel and see what's kind of going on underneath the hood.
Right. And then there are other things I do as well. I don't know if there's a great evidence, but I admit I do a scoop of acai powder every day. organic acai powder from Brazil. I always make sure it's imported from Brazil. I've spent a lot of time in Brazil. And I don't know, it just gives me a boost. I'm not saying a lot of your listeners should do that. I do it because I've had some concerns that maybe I have some deficiencies in antioxidants and bioflavonoids. So I do that. But, having a well-rounded diet is extremely important, right? And the same thing for your exercise routine, having a well-rounded exercise routine as well. Okay, so if you're the type of gal or guy who's just hits the gym, the weights really, really, really hard, well, you don't give up on your stretching routine. Don't give up on your core stability. Don't give up on your yoga movements. Don't give up on some of that cardio, right? Because there's a whole, there's the food menu that we want variety from, but there's also the movement menu, right? So we want movement nutrients as well.
And on probably a final note, something I think I remember reading in The Stress of Life, and it was talking about just what the body's has kind of a standardized response to stress almost. Like doesn't really matter where the stress is coming from, it tends to have the same kind of physiological response. And I think it was talking about how kind of you retain water. It's just kind of like a preventative. The body seems to prevent water. I don't know if is that right? What is the standardized response to stress, if there is one?
Right. So thinking back to Hans Selye and his famous, general adaptation syndrome, the alarm stage, the activity stage, the exhaustion stage, right? Okay, so that's what he discovered in inducing these stressors with rodents. What he later wrote about is something called the local adaptation syndrome. Okay, so that was in later writings, and most of your listeners will not probably be familiar with it. But he also describes local stress. So it's very applicable to someone who's, they do their leg day. Well, you have the local inflammatory response. What you're talking about here is inflammation. One of the hallmarks of someone who's chronically stressed is that not only do they sometimes not recover well, but they do not react as well. Their reactivity is not as good. Okay, so the whole point of the stress is a process, right? And that really should go back to the definition, right? It's a process. So you react really hard, and then you recover really fast, right? So a good stress response is you react and you recover, you react and recover. Some people are able to react, but then they can't recover very well, or they have this prolonged, protracted recovery. And then there are other people that just barely react, and they just sort of they stay elevated for a long period of time. And as part of my dissertation, we looked at 3 inflammatory biomarkers. We looked at tumor necrosis factor alpha, we looked at interleukin-1 beta, and we looked at IL-6. And what we found in some of these inflammatory biomarkers is that in our stress population, they didn't have the reactivity. They just sort of, they had a small reaction, and they just sort of lingered for a while. Whereas our low stress individuals, they had a really strong reactivity, and then they had a really strong recovery. So I don't know if that exactly gets to your question, but the body should react. Okay, the body should react. That's normal. We're not trying to suppress a reaction, but we're trying to react strongly, and we're trying to recover strongly. And by doing that, you have the super compensation response, right? And then, a day later or 2 days later, you're able to do another training bout, perhaps just as strong, and you're able to have another reaction and recovery. And then a few days later, another reaction and a recovery. That's the goal. What you don't want to be in is in the state, perhaps, where you're just barely reacting, and your cortisol is staying high, and it's not recovering. And so I think if that's the case, that's when you start seeing some of these lingering physiological effects that you're describing.
Yeah, I definitely see it. I think it was described in some of the Minnesota starvation studies, and the guys had edema on the ankles, and I've definitely seen that myself when I've been dieting a long time for a competition, and I think some competitors get it. And then, like you said, carbohydrates, come to the rescue, and sometimes that can help to alleviate a lot of the stress, and the physique kind of tightens up. So it's super interesting. It's kind of like you need that stressor to be removed. You need that adaptation before you get the kind of thing you're looking for.
Well, and another thing to add to that is, by the way, stress has an effect on so many of our other health behaviors. So some people, when they get stressed, they start drinking more. They're literally more thirsty. And then other people, they lose their sense of thirst.
Oh, wow.
They're just not thirsty, and then I've noticed this with some of the clients I've worked with, and I say, hey, you haven't been drinking any water. Don't you think you should be drinking some water? And they, oh, no, I'm fine. I'm not thirsty. I'm doing really good. No, you really, really need to be drinking some water. I think you're really entering a state of dehydration. And they're like, oh, I'm fine. Like, well, why are you having headaches right now? Like, why are you just feeling so sluggish and down? I mean, maybe it's just so. Stress has an effect on your sense of thirst. It has an effect on your sense of hunger. It has an effect on your sense of energy and fatigue. So again, going back to that sort of like stress profiling, even people who, when they're stressed out, they stop flossing. I mean, like, there are like really interesting studies on that. They give up little things, like they give up their flossing, right? This morning I was in a rush to get to the interview because it's really early here. So I didn't shave quite as well as I normally do, so I've got a little more facial hair today. But these things are cumulative and they add up over time. So it's really hard to tease out, like, okay, you're seeing like you're noticing something about yourself, but really, what is really the source of that effect? You might be, you may not be able to see it. Okay. So again, that's why you need a good trainer or a good coach, right? I mean, they can see things that you literally cannot see.
Fantastic. Amazing. I've really enjoyed this chat, Matt. And thank you so much for making the time and being here. I want to make sure if people want to learn more about you, see your research, where is it that if they want to kind of find out more about yourself, they should head?
You know what? That's an excellent question. They can just literally Google my name. I'm sure you'll have some sort of name typed out there. I actually have a hyphenated last name. It's Matthew Stults Koleinen, Koleehmainen. But if you just put in Matthew Stults, Stults, that's fine. And then you'll find all sorts of stuff. If you find my profile on Teachers College, the Teachers College Columbia website, then you can link with me directly through my email.
Amazing. I'll make sure to have that linked, and also I know I've got kind of various bits of your research from ResearchGate, so I'll make sure that profile is up there as well, so people can read into the studies, dig into it, because stress is super interesting. So thank you once again, Matt, for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge, and I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.